The way I took observations was from like drawing on a sociocultural perspective. I wanted to make sure that it wasn't just me having the power and writing observations around what I saw. I wanted observations to come from multiple perspectives. So I took, at a very basic level, I took quite a few post-it notes, and these were just jottings. And these mainly came from incidental conversations I had with either Ella's parents on drop-off or with educators that had worked with her from different rooms, or any other observations that came up. They gave me a really strong basis to understand a little bit about Ella. Ella, she moved to Australia from the Netherlands six months ago, so she's very new to Australia. And about her talking about her sister Holly and how she loves her sister so much. So there was lots of frequencies referring to her going to the library. So she very much loved visiting the library and books and literature with her sister. I decided to do like a language transcript that I would later analyze to start planning the activities. So what I didn't get from my post-it notes was really kind of like understanding of what Ella could and what Ella couldn't do.
For us as pre-service teachers, when we go into services and we're only there for a short amount of time, we do rely a lot on a lot of that background information that's shared to us from our supervising teacher and other educators and the family. And often students fall into the trap saying that, I know all this about the children that I'm working with. And so I asked them, well, how do you know all that information and how did you document that? And that there has to be a way that we record that information so that then we can use it further on in our planning cycle and as part of our data that we're collecting. So for the students, for our pre-service teachers, when they're on placement, I would think that they'll do a lot of jottings in the sense that will form observations of the child doing something. But it's also important to do some of those other ones like that language transcript that you had there as well. We're going to get to that a bit later in our conversation as well, but making sure that we're using this data that we've collected through our pedagogical documentation to inform the choices that we're making down the track.
Yes, I definitely felt like I reached that point where I had so much data and I was like, okay, what now?
There's no steadfast rule as to how many observations we should have. But what I tell our pre-service teachers and anyone working in the sector is that you have to have enough observations to help you create an image of what's happening with that child.
The assess phase is kind of where I bring some of that data together in a bit more of a formal way. When I looked at the early years framework, this is what it was telling me around what children should be doing and what we should be working towards for young children in relation to storytelling and creativity and opportunities to support positive relationships. So these are ones that I felt were really relevant, kind of like a benchmark to be able to look at, okay, this is what the early years framework suggests. And obviously it's going to be different for a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. This is going to look quite different. And that's where my knowledge came in around, okay, what's appropriate for Ella to be doing as a 5-year-old.
In the assessment phase, we use our professional knowledge and determine what those observations that we had taken are now telling us about the child and what is important about that. And so an observation, it has no meaning unless we have completed that assessment or analysis of the observation. And so it's the key part of that. It's where we also, as you talked about, link in the connections to the EYLF and the curriculum framework.
In terms of the assessment component for Ella, I used all my data that you saw in the previous section. And based on that, I actually pulled together a learning story. I used the jottings, the language transcript, and that basic analysis that I came to in my head before I sat down and properly analysed and pulled together a piece of assessment. I kind of pulled them all together into a learning story. And a learning story is literally that idea of telling a story. So I also thought it could be nice to have a story for Ella of her journey of this unit of inquiry. So this is not the whole learning story. And I'm assuming that I would attach the whole learning story in the appendices of my assignment. Is that right, Mel?
We don't, in the assignment, we don't necessarily have a whole appendices section, so you can provide your evidence within each section of the assessment task. And it doesn't have to be every single piece of documentation or every single analysis that you've undertaken. In the assignment, the best way to describe it is to pick out the gold star versions of what you've done across the course. And so what do you want to share with us as evidence that you completed this assess and analyze stage of the planning cycle, and show us, a really good, high quality example of that, and making sure that each piece of evidence that you include is connected to the piece that you provided in the previous stage. When we are conducting our assessment phase or our analysis stage and interpreting the learning that's taking place, that's when we start to think about, well, where am I going to take this child's learning now? Is thinking, okay, I've got this data, I now know this information about the children, and this has then led me into this unit of inquiry that I'm going to start to plan and implement with the children.
Here we go. We're in the planning phase now. And what I did is, over a 2-week period, planned 3 learning experiences over that 2-week period. And that mainly because Ella didn't attend every day. And so I needed more time. So I needed 2 weeks in order to get the activities done properly. But in addition to that, there were 2 more incidental activities that came up as well. So I started with just a very basic one-on-one book reading with Ella of the story of the 3 Little Pigs. And what I wanted to do here is I wanted to practice taking on a role of a character and using a particular voice. So she could be the wolf, or I could be the pigs, or she could choose a particular character. That would tell me a lot about, in terms of storytelling, if she understood that she's not Ella anymore, she's a wolf. A Vygotskian concept around children and their imagination. So to be able to no longer be Ella and be a wolf, that's a developmental process, because they actually need to be able to understand that, oh, I'm someone different, I'm taking on a role. And so I did a plan, like a kind of a semi-lesson plan for this activity, where I made sure there was time and resources had all been planned out, and I wasn't thinking on my feet. I was actually planning it out, and I had some prompting questions, and I had identified some teaching strategies. For example, I was going to model to her but how I would take on a role. And then I had some plans around that sustained shared thinking. If she was able to take on a role, how I could sustain that imaginative play by being able to respond back to her and in that shared imaginary situation. I then developed that into the next activity, storytelling with puppets. And again, because the end goal was show and tell presentation type thing, this was more of a soft version of that. The last thing that we did is kind of like a little mini world of the 3 Little Pigs in Lego. In this activity, it was about the arts and crafts around in relation to creating the world. But then we built on that by telling the story using the world that Ella created. So that they were the kind of the 3 experiences that I planned based on trying to get Ella, trying to support her in developing those storytelling skills.
I like the way, based on those observations and the analysis, there were then some initial learning experiences planned. I wanted to point out that those learning experiences didn't take over the whole program. They were just individual types of one-off learning experiences. So it didn't mean that the whole thing about storytelling or the 3 Little Pigs took over the whole entire program for the children. And I wanted to point out they were still really play-based and quite open-ended. And while there was a little bit of structure to them, it was the way Ella engaged with them sort of shaped how they evolved. And her engagement was quite open-ended and really, like I said, in that play-based kind of way, and that you had thought about the strategies that you were going to use as a teacher prior to in the planning stage of that process. So you had, before you did it with Ella and the other children, you were thinking about what your role was going to be as the teacher and documenting those strategies that you were going to use, what questions you were going to ask, how you were going to, when you were going to take it, what role you were going to take in it, when you were going to be involved in the play, and when you were going to step away. So thinking about all those things in that planning stage and making sure they're documented in your learning experience plan.
Yes, because it's so often you get, I'm glad I did that, because there's so many things you need and you often don't remember till you're in there if you haven't done the thinking through properly first. So I don't think the experiences would have actually developed into what they did if I hadn't have had it all prepared.
And also, sorry, one more thing, thinking about because we're talking about a small group or a larger group of children, thinking about how you might differentiate your teaching and your strategies and your the plan for various children within the group too.
So I thought I would show you what that looked like in terms of the implementation component of it. Here are some photos of the Three Little Pigs craft activity, some kind of images of that. And I found that this was a really good kind of launching platform to support Ella in the next stage in relation to the show and tell. I kind of had this little toolkit of her Three Little Pigs props, and she was then able to kind of spontaneously bring them into her play as she saw fit or as she wanted to. So that planning that I had done then had a ripple effect on Ella, because she was then able to kind of access those tools and props and play with them as she wanted to. And so we saw her taking on that leadership role and initiating, and then starting to show those skills that she had with her peers, which then helped for when she did her final piece of show and tell. The implementation kind of just showed how I planned and then how it developed, and then kind of the final implementation of an activity or an experience to kind of be able to compare end to end.
So in the implement phase, obviously this is where it all comes together. The observe, assess and plan all comes together, and we actually do what we said we were going to do. If you think of the planning cycle in a circle, the observe and assess starts to come back in onto the implement phase. So when we're implementing, we're also observing the children, engaging in the learning experiences that we have planned. So we're taking more observations, which leads to more assessment, which, as Victoria's then said, leads to further plans. We're doing some more observations, which is then leading further to some more learning experiences. And so for this assessment task and across the course of your placement, we want to see that progression of, here's what I initially planned, and it might just be one learning experience that you've initially planned, or it might be a couple. Here's what I initially planned, and when I implemented it, I observed the children doing that learning experience, which then led to this one and this one and this one. So the circle just keeps going, and it kind of starts to come in on itself a little bit. When you're writing it up, also, we want you to talk about the teaching strategies and the differentiation that we're going to think about. So then in implement, we want to have a discussion about the strategies that I planned, and here's what actually happened. And often when we plan, we go into these learning experiences with all these great plans of, this is what I'm going to do as a teacher. But quite frequently, we'll start off, and then the children will take it in a whole different right angle direction. We think we're going to do, farm animals in the Play-Doh, and we have the farm animals, but then someone's got a car from the block corner and they bring that over to the Play-Doh, and it goes in a whole different direction. So if that happens, That's fine. We roll with that. That's part of the role of the teacher, and that's what I want you to talk about in the implementation phase. I also want to note that if you are taking photographs of the learning experiences that you've planned, making sure that there is not one tiny part of a child in any of those photographs.
So in terms of the evaluation and the critical reflection component of it, here what I wanted to focus on was kind of looking at drawing in some of the Vygotskian concepts. So thinking about Ella and what she did and how I could link this to theory. And so I did mention that earlier. One of the theories that I want to focus on was the Vygotskian theory, especially around the imaginary situation. Some of the work that Vygotsky's done and that has been cited and developed by others very much looks at the power of the child in being able to change what they see from what they call the optical lens to be able to change the meaning to something else. So whether it be a phone becomes an aeroplane or a cup becomes a house. At the same time, I also used the Vygotskian concept of the zone of proximal development in terms of assessment. So I wanted to understand what is the learning distance, so to say, between the starting point and the ending point. What can Ella do in order to plan learning sequences? And then now that I've planned them and done them, well, where is Ella now? They were the key parts that I had in my evaluation, linking to Vygotskian theory and comparing the start and end point of my data. Is there anything else I need to consider for the assignment?
For the assignment, yes, there is. Evaluation is actually divided into two parts. So what you've talked about is part one, and then evaluation and reflection of the program and the learning experiences you've provided for the child or the children as part of that planning cycle, which is really good. And then there is a second part to the evaluation in the assignment where I asked the students to provide two scenarios that demonstrate their effectiveness their practice of evaluating their effectiveness of their teaching and demonstrating its impact on children's learning, which is a little bit what you were talking about how what you had done had impacted Ella's learning. So asking the students to pick two scenarios, two events that happened that they can use to discuss particularly their role as the teacher.
So, Mel, were there any other words of wisdom you'd like to impart in relation to this task?
For each section of the planning cycle, it's a part of the assignment, and keeping each part together. So trying to provide evidence for each part of the planning cycle from what you have done in your practices on placement, and having that evidence within that section of the assignment so that the reader doesn't have to scroll all the way down to the bottom of the appendix every time you talk about, oh, this is evidenced in figure 1, figure 2, figure 3, and making sure that all your evidence is clearly labelled. And if you have included it, you have discussed it in the text that you've added to it. So they're probably the key things I think that I wanted to add.
Hey, well, that's been super helpful. Thank you so much for your advice here. And if I have any questions, obviously your discussion forum is the place to go for all things capstone assessment. Great. Thanks so much, Mel.
Thank you.
Thank you.